Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Asian Development Bank, Environmental Law Champions Train the Trainers program, I'd like to welcome you very much to this exciting afternoon and evening and morning. So good morning to those of us in Europe and Africa. Good afternoon and evening to us in Asia, and good night almost to us in the Pacific, all of the participants. And so Kia Orana from the Cook Islands and Bula from Fiji. So welcome all. It's quite an international group of participants today. So thank you all very much for joining us. We have a very exciting evening tonight, focusing on environmental compliance and enforcement and looking at environmental crime. And we've got two exceptional speakers to share their experiences with us today. This is the second of a series focusing on environment compliance and enforcement. The first looked at environmental impact assessment. This will look at environmental crime, and in November we'll have another webinar with Howard McCann looking at a particular case that was a UK prosecution that had links to India and Indonesia. And then finally in December, we'll wrap up this series and all the Environmental Law Champions programs for the year with a look at a new possible international crime, the crime against the environment called ecocide. And we'll be very privileged to be joined by Professor Christina Voigt and representatives also from Bangladesh, Rizwana Hassan from the Bangladesh Environmental Law Association and from the Environmental Defenders Office in Australia. And that'll sort of look at this whole spectrum of environmental enforcement and compliance. So tonight, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this evening, Dr. Amanda Cabrejo Roux. She is an international legal professional specializing in environmental law, criminal justice, and human rights. And Amanda is currently supporting the United Nations Environment Programme, Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific as an environmental law expert. And in this role, she is contributing to the development and implementation of projects in the area of environmental law and governance, including on environmental crimes with a focus on fighting waste trafficking and wildlife crime. Amanda previously was working as the Associate Legal Officer in the Law Division of UNEP in its headquarters in Nairobi in Kenya. And she's contributed there to the development of environmental law and governance at international, regional and national level. She has extensive experience, especially in the field of environmental crime. And in particular, she was the lead author of a report entitled Tightening the Net Toward a Global Legal Framework on Transnational Organized Environmental Crime, which was published in 2015 by WWF and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Amanda holds a PhD in law for the Sorbonne Law School, and she was a recipient of the Vendôme Prize in 2019, awarded by the Ministry of Justice for her PhD thesis. This is an extremely prestigious award that is given to, I think, a PhD thesis that relates to criminal matters in relation to the legal system. And so we are very excited to have Amanda here today to present for us this evening. So the screen is yours, Amanda. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew, for the introduction, and thank you to all the team behind this series of webinar from ADB and Ariel, and also happy to have UNEP supporting this webinar. So I'm going to share my screen to show you my presentation here. So please let me know if you can see it. Everything good? Yeah.
Yes, we can see it, Amanda.
Yes, all good.
Amanda.
Okay, so I'm going to do my best to give you a global overview of environmental crime, recent trends, and a lot of recent work that's being done, recent research that can be useful with a lot of references in my slides, you'll see. And I will talk from a legal perspective, being a lawyer myself, but here you see I'm talking about legal perspective with an S, and that's also the question that we need to put together quite a few different legal perspectives to really tackle environmental crime. So I'll be talking, first about environmental crime as a phenomenon and then about legal perspectives. So here we go, environmental crime. So for me, as a lawyer, I start by wondering about the definition and the legal definition. And here is the first huge challenge we have with this field, is that we don't have one definition, one legal definition, one international agreement to look at if we look at environmental crime. So this is going to be more complex. So where do we start? So we can start with the environmental the working definition of environmental crime that's proposed in one report by Interpol and UNEP from 2016. So it's very much to look at a collective term describing illegal activities harming the environment, and aiming at benefiting individuals or groups or companies from the exploitation, damage, trade in natural resources, including, but not limited to, serious crime and transnational organized crime. So you see a very broad definition, and the base in terms of legal definition is that we're talking about illegal activities. And this definition of illegal activities is going to be found in quite a few multilateral environmental agreements and also in national laws, of course. So I'll come back to that in the second part. So to give you a quick overview, what are we talking about? So we're talking about so many different types of environmental crime. So here you have a broad list from wildlife and forestry and fishing to illegal mining and illegal trade in waste and chemicals, and also ozone depleting substances, that's often less known phenomenon, and general pollution crimes. I also just want to quickly show a few maps. I think it's always good to have visuals to understand how global this phenomenon is. So here it's a map related to rhino poaching. And yeah, I'm based in South Africa. I'm at the very tip of Africa right now. So this is a map I relate with, and it connects, unfortunately, in a terrible way with the Asia, yeah, here we see how we have to talk beyond regional reach and really connect the issue between different continents. And a different map, because also maybe less known type of environmental crime and issue. Here we're looking at mercury being used by artisanal and small-scale gold mining. And here there's also an issue around illegal trade in mercury that's been exposed. So recently, UNEP, we had a report in 2020 around illegal trade in chemicals. And this would be like one of the interesting focus. And you see Asia and the Pacific are definitely having challenges here, and many other regions in the world. So constant evolving trends in this field, which also make it difficult to tackle in terms of responses, in terms of law enforcement. But here, like to give you also a quick idea, so we have evolving trends when we talk about the modus operandi, especially now in the digital age, a lot of trade and illegal trade happening online. You have changes happening constantly regarding routes and transit hubs. When laws evolve in one place, when enforcement evolve in one place, often the routes change slightly. And then changes in the illicit markets we're looking at. So here I mentioned two reports. The UNODC World Wildlife Crime Report, that's really useful to track the latest trends in terms of wildlife crime and illegal trade in chemicals. I'm also going to show you quickly, next one, yes. I just want to mention like a type of new environmental commodity being trafficked. So this is a type of plants, succulents, that's very much indigenous to South Africa and very, very specific ecosystem here. And it's being over the past few years, it's being trafficked at an incredible rate, really pushing quite a few species already to the brink of extinction, like very, very quickly. So this is like a type of new plant that really is appearing on the map of a new type of traffics. And just to mention a very useful, very new tool that's been made available by the Environmental Investigation Agency. So if you're curious to look at maps, it's also very good to use. So I know there's a lot of academics also today with us for this webinar. So that can be useful to use with students, but also for enforcement authorities to get a sense of what are the products being trafficked in your countries, and this is a very good tool mapping seizures and arrests in this field. And now to give a sense of the scope of environmental crime, of course, we want to talk about the monetary value, but it's very difficult, of course, to estimate the value of illicit markets. So there are different reports talking about different figures. So this would be one recent report offering an estimate. And basically one thing to just remember from that is that environmental crime represents one of the 4 largest criminal areas in the world. So it's really also significant for that reason. And I'm going to just show you also this image, give a sense of the weight of different types of environmental crimes. And you can see illegal logging and trade is really the biggest one in terms of value. So that gives a sense. And then if we talk about the impact, I'm quickly going to mention different types of impact of environmental crime. So the first one on biodiversity and degradation of ecosystems, huge issue, of course, with wildlife trade, but also with all type of pollution to ecosystems. And we more and more talking about climate crimes. If we look at illegal logging and illegal trade in ozone depleting substances, they both have a significant impact in the climate crisis. So it's also a new angle that's emerging. So yeah, ozone depleting substances are less known as a contribution to greenhouse gases, but it's really important. It's not only carbon that contributes. So this trade is also important to tackle under the climate concerns. And then we can talk about the impact on sustainable development and even stability in many regions. So when we see the huge monetary value, of course, of different trades, we understand that there's an impact on local economies and local livelihoods in many parts of the world. So that's another reason for states to be worried and to act on those topics. And then, of course, impact on human health. So that's important with illegal trafficking in waste and chemicals. But we've also seen, of course, now with the COVID crisis, more and more discussion around the links between wildlife crime and illegal logging, pushing species outside of their normal habitats, and to interact more with humans and with the risk to bring multiple diseases. And so that translates in terms of legal debates to discussion around the possibility of a CITES amendment to take into account those new challenges, and also discussion around the need of a new protocol to UNODC. So UNODC is the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, and there's also discussion in that space that are both quite interesting. But to just mention the current approach on that theme from the UN, we're talking about the UN One Health approach to really work together and put together the perspective on human, animal, and environmental health. So that's One Health approach. And further, we can talk about the human cost in terms of human lives being lost because of environmental crime. First, rangers being killed when trying to protect specific endangered species and natural resources. And we can also mention environmental defenders being persecuted or killed for their role in protecting the environment. So it can be wildlife crime, or it can be fighting deforestation or fighting pollution of different type from organized groups, but also from companies. So there's also in that sense a direct human cost to environmental crime. And after this quick overview, I'm going to go a bit more into legal analysis. So here, this first slide is really to show you that environmental crime has this complexity when we talk about legal approach, that it's really very much at the crossroad between environmental law, criminal law, and trade law. And nowadays, I would actually even add human rights law as a new focus we need to take into account when we look at this phenomenon, and we try to look at it in a holistic legal manner. So this is a challenge for lawyers to put together all those different components. And if we look at international legal frameworks, so we first have the trade-related MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements. So most of those sectorial MEAs are going to look at one issue. So here I mentioned the most important ones, Montreal Protocol for ozone depleting substances, CITES for wildlife, and the chemical and waste cluster with Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Convention, and Minamata Convention. So those conventions provide a lot of understanding of what is legal and what is illegal trade. And based on that, national legal framework can be designed to be aligned with those conventions and better address those issues. And I just want to single out the one MEA that goes further in defining criminal behaviors, so not just illegal but criminal, and that is a Basel Convention that says that the parties consider that illegal traffic in hazardous waste and other waste is criminal. So we can see there member states agreed on a very strong level of response to the illegal traffic in hazardous waste, and already at the level of a convention, we have a call for a criminal law response to those phenomena. So that's very interesting. And then at the international level, we also have to look at what I would call a criminal justice convention. So UNTOC on transnational organized crime and UNCAC on corruption, because both those legal frameworks can be useful to look at environmental crime in this and its transnational nature. And so then we need to have the same exercise, I would say, at the level of national legal frameworks on how to best put together, especially environmental law and criminal law, to address different types of environmental crime. So here I show you 3 recent reports. So one on waste crime, and I know Nancy is going to elaborate more. And this was part of a project. UNEP was one of the 9 implementing partners. And Nancy very much worked in that project and was leading it. And Matthew also worked specifically on this guide. So we have all the experts today. And all the guides would include a guide on how to draft legislation on wildlife crime by UNODC, and we also have a guide from UNEP also on wildlife and forest products, very, very much trying to put together those different perspectives, environment, trade, and criminal perspective. So then that also translates. So once we have international legal frameworks, we need adequate national legal frameworks. And then in terms of concrete intervention, concrete action and law enforcement, we also need to be cross-sectorial in approach. And there I just want to mention two initiatives. One is a Green Customs Initiative, which is a partnership of 11 international organizations, and the secretariat is led by UNEP. And the goal is to enhance capacity of custom authorities worldwide to handle environmentally sensitive commodities. So UNODC, the World Customs Organization, Interpol are part of it, and the secretariats of all the trade-related convention. So there, please, if you're yourself part of custom authorities of your country, or you know people who could be interested, there's a lot of online training material on this website that's very useful. And the second initiative I want to mention, that's also a partnership UNEP is involved in, is the Asia Environmental Enforcement Awards. And if Angelo can show us a short video to present this award for the region, that would be great.
A huge number of species are now on the brink of extinction.
Protection of the environment is the key to perpetuating your life.
The police will not leave any stone unturned to catch illegal wildlife trader.
By fighting transboundary crime, we can live in the safer and better planet.
As long as there are still tigers, there will be the Perlitan and the Royal Malaysia Police to protect them.
Women has more potential. They can do anything possible.
We want to send a message to the world that Malaysia is not a dumping site of contaminated waste or pollution.
Serving the government, serving our country, and now serving humanity. This is a recognition that I would cherish and treasure all my life.
Great, thank you. So you saw many people involved in this reality of fighting environmental crime in Asia and the Pacific. And so, yeah, if you haven't heard about this award before, please look at UNEP website to get more information. And here also inspiring stories of many people fighting on the ground in different countries. So, and maybe if you want to apply for next year award, you know, that's always interesting. So I'm going to share again my screen. So I think you can see it now. Okay, so next, again, I want to quickly mention the most recent developments at the international level. So there have been two very interesting resolutions adopted recently. One in the context of the COP of the UN Convention on Corruption in 2019, and the other one in the context of the COP of Unodc, the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime in 2020. So both resolutions focusing on crimes that have an impact on the environment, otherwise environmental crimes, and really insisting and showing this, showing the fact that member states are more and more seeing the need to connect environmental crime with a criminal law perspective and to use the available tools, and especially to use the link with corruption, the link with organized crime, the link with money laundering as different entry points to look at those issues. So two important resolutions, and a third one that's is in the making. It was already proposed by the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, and it's going to lead to a resolution adopted by the General Assembly by the end of the year. So we would have a very specific resolution in that particular field. So we can see in that sense, things are really moving right now at the international level in a good direction. And to give a few examples of recent reports that also make this shift, looking at the linked with organized crime and corruption and money laundering. I would mention, so this report by the Wildlife Justice Commission, very interesting to try to look at convergence between organized crime and environmental crime, and what does that mean? So there is this report. The link with corruption is also very important. So I was mentioning the resolution, and it's really seen as the key enabling crime. So we can do many things in terms of legislation and in terms of law enforcement, but if we don't address this broader issue of corruption, we would really be missing a huge part of the problem. So here are two recent reports by UNODC looking at corruption in different type of wildlife crime. And then money laundering, also very important approach. So if corruption happened before the commission of environmental crime, money laundering comes after, and what happened with the money. And this is also really important to invest more in looking at the links between environmental crime and money laundering to really target those assets, target those flow of illicit money, and to make environmental crime less lucrative, to really go after the money. So we have a few reports here mentioned that look at those links, very important. And concretely, what does that mean? Here, a success story with Malawi. It's a country in Africa that's been improving a lot its response to wildlife crime. So there's been an important reform of the legislative framework in 2016, including working on stronger sentences for wildlife crime to make it a very serious crime. So you can see it can go up to 30 years in imprisonment. And then also a very strong effort in terms of more intelligence-led approaches to investigation, and to really try to not look at only local poachers, but very much at the criminal syndicates and try to stop those syndicates. And a very recent case has been decided. So in June of this year, Malawi court has convicted to 14 years of imprisonment a Chinese national who is recognized as a kingpin of an international syndicate. And this is a conclusion of already quite a complex investigation that has led to the conviction of 18 other people, part of that network. So this is very interesting. It's a very much an approach looking at the full network to really stop a network that was quite established between Malawi and China. So yeah, very interesting. So just to say, this is possible, all those recommendations, all those reports out there, countries are trying to do that. And I thought it was interesting to talk about the Malawi example as it's so recent, and it gives also a different perspective for Asia. And I know many amazing cases are also happening in many countries in Asia, but to also always make the connection with Africa is important. And to quickly mention other innovative legal strategies, one is to use environmental liability model. So beyond criminal law, to look instead of looking at punishment only, to really look at how do we remedy the harm that's being done, And this is something sometimes missing in the, okay, I'm almost done. I
5 minutes, 5 minutes to go. Thank you.
That's really my opening. So yeah, to look at liability lawsuit to address wildlife crime. So that's a different legal perspective. So I put an initiative there. You can look it up. Also, I was mentioning addressing environmental crime through human rights law mechanisms. So this is something that's emerging, looking at the connection with human rights violation, with also gender perspective. So that may be also part of the future in that space. And lastly, because I know you're going to have a session on ecocide, I thought it was also important to mention here international criminal law as one of the space where legal innovation is happening. And of course, there's a discussion of ecocide, but there's also other initiatives. And I wanted to mention this one of All Rise, looking at an innovative interpretation of the crime against humanity, which is already existing in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and to try to connect that to the issue of deforestation in Brazil. So I also invite you to look at that if you're interested. And yeah, and this would be my last slide as a conclusion, just to say many legal perspectives we need to put together, but we also need to always be aware that law and law enforcement is only part of a bigger picture, and socioeconomic change is extremely important. And if we think of demand reduction as maybe the main single factor to really work on, and circular economy as the ultimate goal when we look at waste in particular. So yes, thank you very much. That was me for this introduction, and I look forward to discussing further with everybody.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for that very exceptional overview of what is clearly a particularly challenging and broad area of law. And I mean, I think the interesting thing is that idea that we have no clear definition of environmental crime. And obviously we have national crimes that are criminalized, and there's been some significant work done by organizations such as USAID Wildlife, together with ASEAN, on wildlife crime in this region. But it's also really interesting to see how there is this movement happening at the moment to see how we can deal with this at the international level. So I'm looking forward to some questions after our next presentation. And can I say that at the conclusion of Nancy's presentation, please either write your questions in the chat box or raise your hand, and we can call on you to ask a question to our panelists. And we will plan for at least 40 minutes of question and discussion on what is, I think, quite a interesting and fascinating topic of environmental crime. So I'd now like to call on our next presenter, Nancy Isarin, whom I have met and have worked with on the WasteForce project, which was a project between a number of consortium partners and looked at the EU and Asia in the context of waste crime. So Nancy has over 23 years of experience in the enforcement of waste shipment regulations and combating illegal waste trafficking. She started her career as an environmental inspector and as a member of the National TaskForce on Serious Environmental Crime in the Netherlands. Since 2006, she's been supporting and leading various international initiatives that aim to control waste trade, disrupt illegal trafficking, support operational enforcement collaboration, increase the capacities of law enforcement agencies, and enhance the prosecution of environmental crimes. That sounds like a fabulous job description. Amongst her clients are international organizations such as UNEP, the World Customs Organization, UNODC, Impel, INICI, and the World Bank. And she is a consultant with AmbienDura. It's a great pleasure to welcome you, Nancy, and the screen is now yours for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew, for this kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure speaking to you during this webinar on environmental crime. It probably will be difficult to top Manda's presentation. I was impressed by the overview. And as Matthew said during his introduction, I don't have exactly a legal background. I'm more of a practitioner and I have more experience in the field with investigations and preparing prosecution cases. And just one thing what always comes to my mind is that already in 1997, when I was writing my thesis, my topic was already on environmental crime. So that's almost 25 years ago now. And it's very interesting and good to see that now the whole topic of environmental crime is really back on the international political agenda. And I hope we can really, make a next step in protecting human health and the environment at this point in time. So I will share my slides with you now. 1 second. It should go to presenters mode.
Yes, that's great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So the topic of this webinar is on environmental crime, but as my background relates mostly to waste, I will zoom in on the issue of waste trafficking. And as Amanda already started her presentation with the question, what is actually environmental crime? There is until now no agreed definition of environmental crime. And the same relates to the definition of waste crime in this case. Looking to a study that was carried out on the EU waste sector, it was noticed that waste is increasingly viewed as a resource or as a secondary raw material, resulting in the global trade of this commodity. And we see also increased controls and regulations applying to waste management and waste shipments. And this change has created conditions where scrupulous operators now mix with the legitimate waste sector, which makes it a very difficult area to detect and investigate types of waste crime. This study says that waste crime is an environmental crime. Again, there's no definition, and a form of white-collar crime, which exploits physical characteristics of waste, the complexity of the collection and the downstream structure, and the market opportunities for profit. So here already, as I said, there is no definition of environmental crime. Why does this concept relate to white-collar crime? First of all, because of the complexity of the waste management trade and business. If you look how waste is being traded and the number and type of actors that are involved in the trade, it's very easy to see legal traders or legal operators being mixed up with illegal operators or illegal opportunities for waste management. Secondly, also the nature of waste itself make it more easy to either mix it with non-waste or non-hazardous types of waste and concealing the actual content and the composition and the impact and the hazardousness of the waste. And also what is now becoming more and more clear is that waste crime is very often linked to also other types of financial crimes. So hence the link with white-collar crime. If you look to why is waste crime happening in the first place, if we look both at the international field but also at national level, there is often a very unclear legislation, which means, for example, fake definitions on what is actual waste or what is considered non-waste, hazardous versus non-hazardous waste. And this unclear definition in the legislation leaves room for interpretation and evasion of the provisions. The second challenge is that enforcement, monitoring, inspections often have a very low priority on the political agenda. And authorities are always struggling to find enough resources to carry out enforcement actions. And then also, if illegalities have been detected, the challenge is to prosecute and investigate these cases, which can be very time-consuming and very complex. And then the last step in that would be the prosecution of those offenses. And there you can see that prosecutors do not have sufficient knowledge in all cases to deal with these complex cases. And if they are willing to take a case to prosecution and to court, we see that the sentencing and the penalties are often quite low and do not offer sufficient deterrent effect. As I said earlier, due to increased regulations and provisions for waste management, costs for legal disposal of the waste have increased, therefore making it attractive to find other and cheaper ways to get rid of the waste, which can lead up to sometimes a cost saving of 200 to 300% of the legal disposal costs. Fourthly, waste has become a global commodity. On the one hand, feeding into the needs of states that need these kind of materials for their production, and on the other hand, also offering a quite broad range of standards for treating this waste, and thus creating the market where lower standards for waste treatment are often cheaper. So leading to different standards for waste treatment and causing loopholes in the whole treatment chain. As I already said, there is a quite complex business structure behind the waste trade. Later on in the slide, I just give you an example of the type of actors that can be involved in the waste trade, and the different change that are playing a role in the business trade, which also make it easy for scrupulous operators to get involved in the business structure. And lastly, the appearance of the waste. Waste is quite easy to mix and to hide, again, which make it easier to commit or to be involved in a waste offense. Here I changed the title of my slides to waste trafficking. I've done that on purpose because, again, there is still no clear definition on waste crime nor waste trafficking. People who are familiar with the Basel Convention text, if we talk about illegal trafficking of waste, we think of Article 9, which clearly defines what is considered to be trafficking of waste. However, if we only would see it in the context of the Basel Convention, first of all, it would only apply to the parties to the Basel Convention, and not all important parties are party to the Basel Convention. So you would already leave out some important key players if you refer only to the Basel Convention definition. And secondly, also people would normally link Basel Convention with the transboundary movement of the waste itself, thinking in that sense that only the transboundary movement could be an illegal act, while we want to go beyond the transboundary movement act itself. So in short, waste trafficking, you can say it's an illegal act with waste. And there are three components just in this very short sentence that are then, if you want to detect and prosecute a case of waste crime or waste trafficking, you would have to prove. And first of all, the term illegal. There has to be a legal regime in place, and any activity that is not in that regime, it should be considered unlawful or unauthorized. So the law should very clearly distinguish between what is an illegal or an authorized act with waste and what is unlawful. Then the second part is the act. So what can be done with waste? Again, if we would only refer to the Basel Convention, you might think only on the transboundary movement of waste. But here we want to go, or we should go broader, and it starts with collection of the waste, transporting, processing or storing the waste, interim storage, disposing, dumping or landfilling, or otherwise illegal management of the waste. And then the third part is the most interesting one. That's also one of the reasons why I'm already active in the waste field for 23 years, is the definition of waste. What is actually a waste? And this is an ongoing discussion. It's often a gray area. What one entity considers as a waste for other is a secondary raw material or a secondhand good. These are three key definitions or concepts that need to be very clear in case you want to fight waste trafficking. So some of the impacts of waste trafficking, Amanda talked already about the general impacts of environmental crime, and they also, of course, can be seen in relation to sorry.
Nancy, 10 minutes to go.
Yeah, no worries.
Minutes.
No worries. These also relate to waste trafficking itself. So impact on the environment and human health. If waste is treated in an unsound manner, it will cause soil, air, and or water pollution. Also, it will impact human health directly by being exposed, of course, to illegal activities of waste, but also by pollution that is entering, for example, in the food chain via oceans and grazelands where cattle is feeding themselves. So also indirectly, human health is threatened by illegal trafficking of waste. Loss of jobs. The illegal waste market undercuts legal businesses that want to treat the waste according to the standards and the legislation. So also for in terms of social and economic impacts, trafficking of waste is should have a higher listing in the political agenda, I would say. Loss of public trust. Also, when it comes to collecting waste from households or collection schemes or extended producer responsibility schemes, if it becomes known to the public that the waste collected is being treated at the end of the pipe improperly, you will lose the support by the public and the engagement of the public. And final thing not to be underestimated is, again, improper treatment of waste also will lead to a loss of resources. The example on the photo shows burning of copper, of electronic waste, but electronic waste also holds very many other precious materials that especially nowadays are becoming more and more valuable, and shortage is turning up. So a better treatment of this kind of equipment, for example, also realizes the reuse and recycling of those materials. And again, waste trafficking is often linked with other types of crime like tax evasion or corruption or money laundering. Just some very practical examples of how illegal trafficking of waste can manifest itself. I will show, of course, some visually more visible examples. So in this case, it would be waste that is being hidden under other loads. So the picture on the left side, batteries are hidden under a clean metal scrap, and the container on the other side of the screen. Monitors are being hidden behind clean bales of scrap as well. This is an example during a road inspection. It's maybe not clear from the picture, but the top layer shows element cans and of drinks. But when you do a further investigation and we open the container, you see that below are batteries hidden, which are considered to be hazardous waste. Two more examples. This is an example of waste that was declared in the customs documents as clean plastic, so ready to be recycled and to be reused. And then when opening the container, you can see that the quality is so poor that it hinders an actual recycling of the waste. And the last example is dumping of parts of e-waste that cannot be easily reused. Here I would like to also make the link with plastic waste, which I know is since 2018 has been an emerging threat in the Asian Pacific region. Plastic waste are not only the PET bottles or the packaging materials, but plastic is also very existing in e-waste, and then it could also hold hazardous materials. In terms of the organization behind waste trafficking, as I said, it can be a quite complex chain. At the national level, you have a variety of actors playing a role: the waste generators and companies involved in the collection and transporting of the waste, storing the waste, but also brokers and dealers play an important role. Then if waste is being shipped across borders, you are dealing with different types of actors that also play an important role, and on the importing side. And then on the public side, you also are dealing with different entities, of course, environmental authorities, but collaboration with customs and border management agencies, port authorities, police, prosecutors is also key in combating this type of waste crime. One of the tools that is currently being developed is a legislative guide by the UNODC, and it's a guide that contains model provisions on how to develop a criminal justice tool in national legislation fighting waste trafficking. And this is a very clear example that Amanda mentioned earlier, is where in this case the Basel Convention is mixing up with the with UNODC, so the Convention on Organized Crime and on Corruption, and how to find a good balance between the different interpretations in those international agreements. I will not go then in too much detail. The guide is now in the final stages, and hopefully it can be published over the coming months, I would say. It not only deals with defining the offense of waste trafficking, but it also refers to the liability, the involvement of natural and persons or businesses, what can be considered, for example, as aggravating circumstances for waste trafficking, how to deal with compensation and storage costs. That is something that also the Waste Force project looked at, is how can you calculate the damage that has been caused by the illegal act. So this is also then the liability coming back, and how to, in your sentencing, include also the costs for restoring and paying for the damage of the illegal act. And what should not be underestimated is the role of, well, not only victims, of course, that are affected by the illegal act, but also the role of witnesses and possibly whistleblowers or informants in bringing certain illegal activities to the surface. So it's my last two slides. I would like to close with say what I consider key for disrupting waste crime or waste trafficking: clear definitions. In those 25 years I'm involved in this business, there's an ongoing discussion on the definition of waste and hazardous versus non-hazardous. So law enforcement communities would be helped with clearer definitions or guidance on certain concepts. A clear list of offenses, so not only for the companies involved in the waste trade business, but also for law enforcement community, is what is illegal, what is not illegal, and related to that, in case of an offense, what is the sanctioning that is that relates to that offense. And as I said, at least in EU law, sanctions must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. So they must have a sufficient deterrent effect for companies or operators that want to get involved in illegal activities. There should be sufficient legal powers or mandates for law enforcement authorities to, first of all, to detect waste trafficking, but also then to investigate waste trafficking. To use maybe even special techniques to prove their case and to collect evidence. Very important is the cooperation, interagency collaboration at the national level. For example, collaboration between customs and environmental authorities. At the regional level, mainly to prevent port hopping, as we would call it in Europe, to happen. So if a certain company is exporting the waste to a certain port, but if enforcement actions increase in that port, they might starting to use other routes to get rid of their waste. So also at the regional level, we make a strong appeal to the countries involved to have a more joint approach, and also at the international level, especially in the international waste trade. And the final point is that it's important for, I would say, all law enforcement entities is knowing how to deal once they have detected an illegal case of waste imports or exports, and how to deal with repatriations, because it's, even though it's at the end of the chain, but dealing with illegal waste traffic is also an important part of the overall response to waste trafficking. And then I would say the last case, which is much focused on now in the Asian Pacific region, is the case of plastic waste. We saw a big shift in the global trade in plastic waste following the decision by China to close their borders for import of plastic waste in 2018. This has led that some countries in the region suddenly imposed national import bans for certain types of plastics, and then exporters trying to find other destinations in the region or in other parts of the world. We also saw that at the level of the Basel Convention, amendments on plastic waste came into force as 1st of January this year. Where before plastic waste was considered non-hazardous, as of January 2021, there is a new category for hazardous plastic waste and one for mixed plastic waste, and shipping that waste across border would require a prior informed consent procedure. Which is all nice to have that at the multilateral environmental agreement level. However, these amendments need also then to be implemented in national legislation, enable for law enforcement to take action. And there are at the moment various activities going on in the region by international partners like the WCO, UNEP, and the UNODC to help law enforcement authorities to build capacity in the area of plastic waste. So with that, I would like to close my presentation. I hope I was within the time, Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nancy, for that overview. And so can I now have both Amanda and Nancy on screen, and we can open up for questions. I mean, and Nancy, thank you again for, that focus on waste, because I think it's really also still quite interesting that with waste we have Basel Convention, so we have an international overview, but it also has to be implemented at a national level. And as someone who has prosecuted on behalf of local government authorities as a barrister in Australia, in New South Wales, waste crimes as well as planning crimes and various other environmental crimes such as native vegetation crimes, that implementation at the national level can be very important, because whether it's national laws or even state laws, in the case of federation, how those definitions can be used and matched can often be very, very challenging. So thank you again, both Amanda and Nancy, for your presentation. Can I just also remind people that please, if you would like a certificate, please follow the link that Angelo has put in. And in terms of the presentations at the conclusion of the webinar, we will be putting these presentations on the Teach Environmental Law Asia website, as well as the YouTube link for the video of this for your further entertainment. So there's also a lot of other interesting materials on the teachenvironmentallaw.asia website that is available free of charge. So we have a couple of questions. If there are people who would like to ask questions, not just on waste, but they could be on any form of environmental crime or raise an issue, please feel free to raise your hands. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box. and I'll get to those first. So there's one question which I think is a very interesting one, is how do you deal with the politicization of waste when it comes to nuclear proliferation and the passage of nuclear wastes through international waters? And I guess that is sort of wastes that are radioactive or meet certain radioactive requirements through international waters, and the lack of accountability of where they are dumped, noting that they moved from the Northern Hemisphere into the Southern Hemisphere through Asia Pacific and Pacific waters. So does anyone would like to look at the idea of transshipment or international transshipment of nuclear or radioactive waste? Nancy, have you any experience? Yeah.
Well, no, actually, I don't have, because radioactive waste is one of the few waste that has been exempted from the scope of the Basel Convention. I know there are other sorry, yeah.
No, go on.
No, there are other international instruments in place that deal specifically with radioactive materials and waste. But personally, I do not have any experience with those.
Amanda? Is this?
Yeah, I was going to say the same. It's excluded from the scope of Basel, and yeah, I'm not expert enough in the specific legal frameworks on radioactive waste. But yeah, I mean, a general comment would be that, of course, international law and legal frameworks are created in the middle of political and diplomatic challenges, and they represent political solution and compromise. And in that sense, we can be sometimes frustrated with what we see in environmental law or international law and thinking it's not enough. But we can also be hopeful because the law is never fixed, and there are always ways to fight for better legal frameworks. So I'm not sure on the specific legal issue, but where there are gaps, we can also fight for filling those gaps or improving the legal frameworks to create a better and more fair situation for all the countries involved and all the populations involved.
And I guess just following that on that politicization, I mean, you've both sort of seen such as the plastics ban and also seen nation states, especially a number in Asia, that have imposed bans on the importation of waste, partly in response to the changing environment following the Chinese ban on import of waste. I mean, have you seen that, in fact, in plastic waste, that the politicization of that issue has actually increased the focus on trying to control some of these transboundary waste streams, such as plastics or other hazardous waste?
Well, I can give my view on that. There seems to be, within some nation states, there seems to be then a conflict on the one hand, trying to protect their environment from unwanted plastic waste, but on the other hand, they want to also facilitate the import of good quality plastic waste because they need it for their recycling or their production industry. So there you see at national level, you see the different interests coming to play when it comes to importing requirements for plastic waste. Yes. So it's then more a Ministry of Trade issue versus Ministry of Environment issue.
So there could be conflict within countries about the idea of waste as a resource, or the idea of waste as a bad, as a pollutant. Yes,
and also it can also be related as if some countries do not have a national collection scheme in place, or a good functioning national collection scheme. It might be easier to import waste from abroad, which then on the one hand is good again for production, but on the other hand it does not stimulate to improve national collection schemes for that specific waste stream.
And I guess I also have just one sort of question that's a little bit of a follow-up, is both with wildlife trade and waste trade, it seems that there's an illegal component of illegal trade, or a proportion of the trade that is illegal. And I've read some arguments for suggesting that indeed the trade itself should be prohibited, to make it all unlawful. I'm wondering if that's if we're going to ever get to that stage where things like waste or trade in endangered species might be totally prohibited.
I mean, it's difficult to talk about all the type of trades together there, I guess the background of all of that is we look at environmental commodities and we look at sustainable economies. So the basic idea is not to prohibit completely any type of trade, but to make sure that what is traded is done in a way that's sustainable for the environment and for the local population and ecosystems. So that was the mindset, if you want, of the CITES Convention on trade in endangered species, was not to say there is no trade, but was to say, well, some countries in the world are wealthy of natural resources, of wildlife, and they should be able to exercise their sovereignty on their natural resources in that sense and decide to trade them, but just to do so in a way that maintains the survival of the species. So yeah, of course, there are economic factors and environmental factors. And as Nancy say, in the context of waste, we have the same dynamics of allowing sector and industry that makes sense, that's doing something good for the society at large, because our society produces waste and we need to handle this waste. So it's good to have industry strive to find solutions and better ways to handle this waste. So yeah, full ban is not often the best solution, but then maybe looking at very specific commodities. Different countries choose different policies. If we think about ivory, quite a few countries say, well, on ivory, we want to be very clear that we have a complete ban. So I mean, of course, with CITES also having different level of protection of some species are completely out of trade. So in that sense, there is a ban, and some species are traded. So I guess it is always a complexity in the environmental sphere that there are many regimes that are existing at the same time, and they're also evolving with the science and the reality of species and the reality of pollution. So yeah, there's no easy yes or no answer on those topics.
And Nancy, in terms of, since 1997, when you were doing your thesis on waste, clearly there's still a lot of waste crime happening. I mean, have you seen, how does that, from a practical sense, impact on the idea of whether this is something that should be permissible or totally prohibited, or is that simply just not an issue that's really being considered at the moment?
Well, at least already there, for example, under the Basel Convention, and it was already in place in the EU for a longer time, it's an export ban of hazardous waste, for example. So from the EU to non-OECD countries, there was already an export ban for hazardous waste, which I think it's indeed, you should take into account national capacities, but also if it's being exported, what are the standards under which the waste is being treated there? And do you allow that waste would be treated under lower standard circumstances than in your own country or in your own region? Yeah, I cannot say, I'm not getting to a black or white answer. I know it's possible, but yeah, it's the same with e-waste.
We always say environmental crime is really, there's a lot of shades of grey within environmental crime, because it does cover so many issues, and it does require a state to criminalize an activity. This was something when I was doing a project for the Vietnamese Department of Justice, when they were revising their environmental crime, they were also considering issues of strict liability for environmental offences, which is something that we know very much from common law countries, although it may not be necessarily as relevant for code countries, that mens rea is still an issue for environmental crime, but also the criminalisation for legal entities. And that's been something that seems to have changed a lot over those 20 years, that there's a greater recognition, perhaps, that legal entities should be held responsible, and directors as independent defendants can also be held responsible for their action. Is that something that you've also seen in waste crime, and perhaps it's sort of conceptually at that international level?
It has been slowly improving, but I would say, first of all, waste crime, but it's probably the same with wildlife crime, is that it's a silent crime. So you actually have to look for the crime. It doesn't come to your, knock on your door and say there's a waste crime. So first of all, it starts already with enough capacities to try to detect it in the first place. And the fact that no criminal nor waste offenses are detected doesn't mean it's not there. And that's a kind of a misconception I see. Even yesterday, there was another regional training, and then the question was asked to the law enforcement authorities, have you ever come across in your daily work across a legal case of waste trafficking? And most said no. And then the response was, oh, that's a good thing. But you can explain that in two different ways. Okay, maybe it never happened, or maybe they never been actually out there looking for the waste crime. So that's one thing. And as I said also during my presentation, the actual prosecution of those cases are quite time-consuming and complex, and the reward is not that big in terms of sentencing. I can only think of a few cases where also, for example, director of a company had to pay a fine or was sentenced to jail for a couple of months, but it's not that often.
Amanda, did you, from that?
Yeah, that's
overall
definitely
experience?
one of the main challenges, and I don't think it's been evolving quick enough over the past 3 decades, as Nancy says. Well, in the past few years that I've been working in that space, but it's I mean, it's a challenge in criminal law in general to really have criminal liability for legal persons and corporations, and there are different levels of legal frameworks depending on the countries and depending on the culture of each country. But definitely in that space, so we're seeing more, I was talking about the shift toward a more criminal law perspective, which is good, but the focus is still very much on criminal syndicates, which are there and are part of the problem, certainly, but very often corporations and companies are also the actors, also the perpetrators, as maybe one act here and there, or as companies that are created for the only purpose to be a cover to a criminal syndicate. Either way, we need to address that directly, and this is certainly the case in waste crime, but also if you think about illegal logging, and also all the field of illegal fishing, we have to be targeting companies. So then, yeah, criminal law is an important tool that needs to be used better toward legal entities and corporations. And then there are other tools, other type of fine, other type of controls that can be used, other type of frameworks that are there with maybe a less strong powers and criminal law, but still useful, and also compliance instruments that sometimes are there and already not being applied. So yeah, it's a full net of legal and regulatory frameworks and enforcement issues, and also capacity issues, as Nancy was mentioning. All of that has to be tackled together.
So we have a couple of questions. One on examples of prosecution for climate crime. Are there examples of prosecutions for crimes relating to climate, or are new laws needed to enable the prosecution of such crimes?
So when I talked about climate crime, it was specifically with the example of illegal logging. and illegal trade in ozone-depleting substances. And I know now the term is being used in a much broader way to try to go after big corporation in the fuel industry, for instance. So this is like another ongoing debate, but definitely where we have crimes that exist to tackle illegal logging and deforestation, there is a clear link with the fact that deforestation is also having an impact in the climate crisis. And the same way, so the ozone depleting substances, some of them have a greenhouse effect. So in that sense, focusing on this industry, and there are cases on that specific challenge. For instance, recent cases targeting networks through Romania and the people being arrested in that context. So it's trafficking. So basically those gases are used in fridges and refrigerants, air conditioning, cooling mechanism. And they are being phased out by the international convention, so the Montreal Protocol in this case. But there's a form of illegal traffic that's been targeted. So it's in that context that I was talking about climate crime. And again, the law is evolving and can be extended in terms of what's covered by criminal law. So, yeah.
So, and then if we can then, we've got a couple of interesting questions about sanctions. And I don't know if Luisito Madronio is actually online at the moment, but the question was raised about sanctions for nations that dump their waste through containers and then transport it in vessels. And I think I think it might be in terms of the idea of some waste that it comes through in containers, but then is then simply disposed unlawfully or illegally. Because that's obviously another issue if the waste or some waste might be imported or materials imported for reuse, but then is diverted for landfill. Are there sanctions available for that? Is that covered under Basel, or is that something that is covered under national domestic laws?
Yeah, so if you look at the Basel Convention, again in Article 9, there it depends very much who was responsible for the illegal act. If it was on the side of the exporter, so if it's coming from another country and the exporter was can be proven responsible for the illegal act of waste, then the country of import has the right to send the waste back to the country of origin. On the other hand, if the illegal act was the responsibility of the importer of the waste, then in the state, another alternative solution has to be found to deal with the waste. In terms of sanctioning, again, if the waste is to be sent back to the country of origin, then it's the country of origin or the country of export that then can take legal action against the exporter. So it would be then the responsibility of the authorities in the exporting country. If the responsibility was for the importing side, then it should be the country of import using their national system for the sanctioning. But that's up to the national, to national states to decide on their sanctioning strategies and policies.
And of course that assumes that the action is taken against the person either importing it, the country who's managing the process isn't going to be subject to any fines or penalties if their system hasn't worked yet. So, and then we've got another question here about how would we deal with pesticide drifts, with pesticides like glyphosate drifting into the forest and organic farms and contaminating, if not devastating, crops. And I would think, in fact, that this is also probably relevant for things like waste dumps where leaching occurs and toxic waste comes out of the particular area of repository and goes across or underneath and impacts on and causes harm to adjoining land and crops. Does anyone sort of want to have a go at answering that question?
I mean, you would have to look at the national legal framework more specifically, I would say. And of course, hoping there's those specific behavior, especially if intentional or reckless, are covered and there is an adequate response. And then, then there's, I suggest having a look at a UNEP report from last year on illegal trade in chemicals to read more about chemicals in general that include pesticide, but that was looking more at international trade challenges. So yeah, I cannot say something more specific.
And Nancy, I guess one interesting question, and you mentioned this in relation to the WasteForce project, was looking at the calculation of damages as a consequence. And I remember a couple of interesting discussions on that, especially from the Netherlands, I think it was, that were looking at that. Can you sort of talk a little bit about that calculation of damages and issues of restoration and restorative justice in the context of environmental matters? And maybe, Amanda, we can come back also to that concept of restorative justice, which I think has emerged a lot in the consequence of these so-called victimless crimes, but still have significant environmental and potentially social impacts. So, but Nancy, perhaps on that issue of damages and quantification.
Yes. Yeah, so this report on the WasteForce project was just a first attempt to try to develop a methodology to calculate the costs. It does not yet include restoration costs or cleanup costs, for example. It only looks at the impact the illegal act has caused to the environment and what the environmental costs are in terms of soil pollution or air pollution or contributing to climate change. So the methodology highlights, I think, 7 or 8 factors or risks that should be taken into account when calculating the costs. One of the things that is still missing is, for example, the whole life cycle assessment of a product, because that was one of the things taken into account, the life cycle assessment of a product in terms of hazardousness or production. At the moment, it does not look at the waste stage. So it does not include, the life cycle assessment does not yet include what the costs are, for example, when that product has become a waste. So that was a gap that was identified. So the methodology is a first attempt to calculate the costs of illegal shipments of waste in this case. I can share the link to the report where there are also some examples of how they calculate.
And I think that the WasteForce, some of that material is available for public, isn't it? Not just for. That would be great if we could share that. And from a legal or environmental legal principle of the polluter pays, there's clearly some good basis for arguing for increasing penalties to ensure that the cost of the pollution is incorporated in the fine or the restoration order. But in terms of that restorative justice and issues like polluter pays in the context of environmental crime, are things moving? I mean, is it becoming stronger in terms of looking at?
So when you mean restorative justice, you mean the liability type of lawsuit for remedies?
Yes.
Yeah, so as you say, I mean, the basis would be the polluter pay principle. And so we have environmental liability for oil spills and pollution. And so the initiative I'm mentioning on conservation litigation is to use this type of approach in the context of conservation and wildlife. which is quite innovative because not really done in that context, even if most countries would have the legal frameworks, but they're not just yet being used. So in my slide that I will be sharing, and I see there's a lot of interest for the slides in the chat, so I'll be happy to share that, and you'll have all the references. So I mentioned a project which is called Conservation Litigation, that's led by some University of Lancaster, if I'm not mistaken, and one of the first contexts where they try to apply this approach is in cases in Indonesia related to an illegal zoo having quite a few individuals of protected species, and so yeah, trying to use that different legal path, which is different from the criminal path, and going after individual perpetrators to impose individual criminal sanction, which is one thing and which is important, but to also say we need to repair the damage that being caused. And as Nancy mentioned, this is a full field in itself to improve the way we create those estimate of the damage and the environmental damage, and we manage to cause that to make sure that whatever legal and litigation path is used, we have a response that helps restore the environment as much as possible. So yeah, another huge challenge.
I think we're coming up to 6:30. If there's any further questions, please, if anyone wants to raise their hands, because I'll now sort of ask our presenters to give us sort of a final thought about the future. We've just had the biodiversity COP part 1 in Kunming, and we'll have a number of issues about pledging to restore biodiversity. I didn't see, I mean, there's something in those declarations about the use of environmental crime. I know also that for UN Environment Programme, we've got the Montevideo 5 program emerging, where enforcement and compliance of environmental laws is one of the elements. And I guess, Nancy, in terms of the practicalities from the people who are actually sort of enforcing the law, what are the things in terms of capacity development and ongoing support that is required? So in the last few minutes, if either of you would like to go forward, just what do you think is going to happen over the next few years in terms of environmental crime in general, or waste crime in particular? And what would you, or more importantly, what would you hope governments can do and the international community can do to focus more on environmental crime itself? Nancy, do you, or Amanda, would you like to go first?
I did not prepare a statement.
No,
but Amanda can go first.
Okay. Amanda, I'll hand to you first.
Yeah, vast challenge to predict the future of this field. Well, we see in the legal field there's a lot of innovation, and yeah, you're going to talk further about the ecocide and a lot of interesting debates. But what I would like to stress is that even with the complexity we've seen and the limitation we've seen, there are a legal framework in place, and there are many authorities working on different parts of the puzzle. And the main challenge, and maybe part of the solution, is really for all those different actors to work more together, which is something we always say, but it's still relevant. We need better cooperation at the international level, at the regional level, at the national level. And we've all seen that we need the environmental expert to talk with customs and police and prosecutors and judges. And we need in that sense, everybody to come together to work on environmental crime.
Thank you. Nancy.
Yes, I would like to maybe point out the following issues. First of all, I think the awareness is now actually, becoming recognized, and that also at the political level, the issue of environmental crimes is now more, on the agenda. So that's, I think, a good step forward, and this is now the momentum to use and to build on that. Secondly, laws and regulations and agreements are really nice, but in the end, it's the entities and the law enforcement officers that have to work with it. So I would make a plea for enforceable legislation. Otherwise, it's just paper. So enforceability checks or assessments of new legislation, or at least taking into account the feedback from the people working in the field on the, what is working out there, what is not working, that policy makers are open for input from law enforcement officers, because I see there's a big gap at national, European, international level on what people see in the field and what people in their offices are writing in terms of legal text. Sorry, no offense to policy or regulators here, but please listen to the people working out there in the field. They tell you exactly where the loopholes are, where gray areas are, and please take that also into account when either assessing legislation or drafting new legislation. And indeed, the last point I would like to reiterate is also what Amanda said. Try to start breaking down the walls between the law enforcement entities. So please find ways to talk with customs, with police and environmental authorities. Consider setting up national task forces, like, for example, suggested by Interpol. Well, when I started my career in the early 90s, I was part of such a national task force in the Netherlands, and it worked perfectly. We had financial investigators, we had police, we had environmental experts, and we could do an investigation from A to Z, and we had all the expertise in one team. It worked perfectly. That concept was lost, unfortunately, but I would make also a plea for national task forces, I think.
So yeah, thank you very much. And again, I think that message of collaboration and cooperation is obviously really vital, but it's that practical way, because as someone who has prosecuted crimes and often been briefed by the Environment Protection Authority of New South Wales, where they did have a complete team. They had lawyers working with investigators and officials, and they all had their clear responsibilities. They had prosecution guidelines, they had professional obligations that were discharged appropriately. But the idea and the ultimate aim was to ensure that there was going to be an effective compliance enforcement strategy, and that can't just be done by the drafting of legislation. I thought, Amanda, the exciting thing in your presentation in terms of the overview of looking at environmental crime, because it does have a number of key elements that are similar depending on whether they're waste, and then there are differences in terms of waste crime and wildlife crime and other forms of pollution, but many of the principles and the approaches to enforcement and compliance are the same. Again, especially in the criminal justice system, there are strict rules and obligations of prosecutors in terms of whether to commence prosecution, and there are also obligations for defendants that are part of the bedrock of an appropriate rule of environmental justice system. But that also has to ensure that the environment as a victim and the community as a victim are also taken into account, because crimes are those activities that governments have identified as being inappropriate conduct, and conduct that should not be allowed, and conduct that in fact should be prosecuted as a type of conduct that is unbecoming for the society in which we live. I think it's going to be really interesting to see over the years how these things developed. We've seen a lot of change, certainly from the beginning of when we were involved in environmental crime. So I look forward to perhaps revisiting this at a later date. Thank you very much, Amanda and Nancy, for your participation in presentations today. Can I also thank Gladys and Angelo for the technical support for bringing this together. And can I also invite you back in November to hear Howard McCann from the Environment Agency in England, talking about a particular waste prosecution that resulted in a significant fine for a major importer and waste management authority. And so that should be quite interesting. That also had impacts because the waste was transported to India and Indonesia. And we hope also to hear from some of those involved in that from the Indian and Indonesian perspective. And then in December, we will look at this new idea, this new amendment to the Rome Statute, which is proposed at the moment, which is the crime of ecocide to join other crimes against humanity and genocide. And there's one other, I think, that's existing. War crimes. But as has already been said by Amanda, there's also already moves to have environmental crimes dealt with under existing sort of international criminal justice. And so that's also quite an interesting perspective and where things may go. So can I thank you all once again for the presentations on behalf of the Asian Development Bank and our supporters, the Asian Environmental Compliance Enforcement Network, Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, and of course, our wonderful partner, the United Nations Environment Programme, that's supporting so many of these events. And Amanda, thank you again very much for your participation. Nancy, always great to see you. And thank you everyone who has participated. We look forward to seeing you next month when we delve a little bit deeper into waste crime. Thank you very much, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.